You know, there are moments in entertainment that transcend the usual laughs and applause, moments that remind us why we connect with certain people on a level that goes beyond just being fans. What happened when Kevin Hart stepped onto that stage last month wasn't just another comedy bit or celebrity appearance. It was something raw, something real, something that left an entire room of hundreds of people completely speechless. I'm talking about the moment when Kevin Hart, the man who's built his entire career on making people laugh, found himself fighting back tears as he talked about Cenat's journey from the streets of the Bronx to becoming one of the most influential streamers in the world. But this wasn't just about success stories or feel-good moments. This was about trauma, about survival, about the kind of pain that shapes a person's entire existence. The setting was intimate, despite the crowd. Kevin was doing a surprise appearance at a content creator summit in Atlanta, and what started as light-hearted commentary about the streaming world took a turn that nobody saw coming. Someone in the audience shouted out Kai's name, and suddenly Kevin's entire demeanor shifted. The comedian who's known for his high-energy, rapid-fire delivery became quiet, contemplative, almost vulnerable. "Y'all don't know about Kai's story," Kevin said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Y'all see the streams, the numbers, the success, but you don't know what that young man went through to get here." And that's when it started. The story that would leave everyone in that room questioning everything they thought they knew about success, about privilege, about what it really takes to make it in this world. Kevin began by talking about the first time he met Kai, not at some industry event or celebrity gathering, but in a completely different context. It was during one of Kevin's visits to a youth center in the Bronx, part of his ongoing community outreach work that he rarely publicizes. This was about 3 years ago, before Kai had blown up to the level he's at now, when he was still grinding, still fighting for every viewer, every subscriber. "I walked into this community center," Kevin continued, his voice getting stronger but somehow more emotional at the same time. "And there's this kid, probably 19 or 20, setting up this whole streaming setup in the corner. Old laptop, makeshift lighting, the whole thing held together with duct tape and determination." The crowd was already leaning in, sensing that this wasn't going to be a typical celebrity anecdote. Kevin has a way of commanding attention, but this felt different. This felt personal. So I go over to him, right? And I'm thinking I'm about to make this kid's day, Kevin Hart walking up to his little setup. But when I start talking to him, when I really start listening to what he's saying, I realize this kid is about to school me on something I thought I understood, but really didn't. What Kevin learned that day was that Kai's streaming wasn't just a hobby or even just a career aspiration. It was literally his lifeline, his way out of a situation that Kevin described as darker than anything I've ever put in my comedy. The room had gone completely silent by this point. You could hear people shifting in their seats, the kind of uncomfortable silence that comes when you realize you're about to hear something that's going to change how you see everything. Kevin's voice cracked slightly as he continued. "Kai told me about growing up in a household where violence wasn't just a possibility, it was a daily reality. He told me about nights when he'd stream until 4, 5 in the morning, not because he was grinding for content, but because those were the quiet hours when he felt safe." This revelation hit the audience like a physical blow. Here was Kevin Hart, a man who's always been open about his own struggles growing up, talking about meeting someone whose pain made his own childhood difficulties seem manageable by comparison. "This kid was using streaming as therapy," Kevin explained, his eyes now visibly watery. "Every night he'd go live, and for those few hours he could be somebody else. He could be funny, he could be entertaining, he could forget about the chaos happening just outside his bedroom door." But Kevin wasn't done. The story got deeper, more painful, more real. Kai's father, Kevin said, pausing to collect himself, his father was struggling with addiction, severe addiction, the kind that turns a parent into a stranger, that makes home feel like a war zone. The audience was completely captivated now, hanging on every word. This wasn't the sanitized version of struggle that celebrities usually share. This was raw, unfiltered truth about what it means to survive in circumstances that would break most people. Kevin described how Kai had explained his streaming schedule, how he'd deliberately stay up all night creating content because those were the hours when his father would finally pass out, when the yelling would stop, when the fear would subside just enough for him to breathe. He'd stream from midnight to 6 in the morning, Kevin continued, then sleep for a few hours while his father was unconscious, wake up, go to whatever job he could find, come home, and do it all over again. Day after day, month after month. The emotional weight of this routine wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Here was a young man essentially living in survival mode, using his creativity and personality as both shield and sword against circumstances that would have destroyed most people his age. But Kevin wasn't sharing this story just to highlight Kai's struggles. He was building towards something bigger, something that would explain why this moment had affected him so profoundly. "What got to me," Kevin said, his voice now barely controlled, "wasn't just the pain this kid was carrying. It was his refusal to let that pain define him. Every night, no matter what had happened during the day, no matter how bad things got at home, he'd turn on that camera and become this beacon of positivity for his viewers." This is where Kevin's admiration for Kai became most apparent. As someone who's built his career on turning pain into laughter, Kevin recognized something kindred in Kai's approach to content creation. "Kai was doing something I've been trying to do my whole career," Kevin explained. "He was taking his darkest moments and transforming them into light for other people, but he was doing it while still living in those dark moments. That takes a different kind of strength." The audience was completely absorbed now, many visibly emotional themselves. Kevin's storytelling had transported them into Kai's world, made them feel the weight of trying to create joy while drowning in personal chaos. Kevin then shared details about Kai's mother, a woman who was working multiple jobs trying to keep the family afloat while dealing with her husband's addiction and her son's obvious distress. His mother knew, Kevin said. She could see what the situation was doing to Kai, but she felt powerless to change it. She was fighting her own battles, trying to keep food on the table, trying to keep the lights on, trying to keep her family from completely falling apart. This added another layer of complexity to Kai's story. It wasn't just about personal struggle. It was about family dynamics, about systemic issues, about the kind of generational trauma that affects entire communities. Kai's mother would sometimes watch his streams, Kevin continued, and she told me later that it was the only time she could see her son truly happy. For those few hours each night, she could watch him be the person she remembered from before everything went wrong. The emotional impact of this detail was visible throughout the room. The idea of a mother finding comfort in watching her son pretend to be okay while everything around them was falling apart struck a chord with everyone present. Kevin then shifted to talking about Kai's breakthrough moment, the stream that changed everything. But even this success story came with complications that most people never knew about. When Kai's numbers started really taking off, Kevin explained, when he started making real money from streaming, it should have been pure celebration. But success brought its own problems. The issue was that Kai's father, seeing his son's newfound financial success, began demanding money to support his addiction. This created an impossible situation where Kai's success was literally funding the very problem that had made his life hell for years. "Imagine working your way out of hell," Kevin said, his voice rising with emotion, "only to have hell follow you into your success." That's what Kai was dealing with. This revelation explained so much about Kai's personality, his drive, his sometimes manic energy on stream. He wasn't just entertaining people, he was outrunning demons that had been chasing him his entire life. Kevin described how this situation came to a head about a year ago, when Kai's father showed up at his apartment, demanding money, creating a scene that forced Kai to call the police on his own father. That night, Kevin said, his voice breaking completely now, Kai called me, 3 in the morning, crying like I've never heard a grown man cry. He kept saying, I had to choose between my family and my sanity, and I don't know if I made the right choice. The room was dead silent now. You could feel the collective emotional weight of hundreds of people processing this level of raw human pain. Kevin talked about staying on the phone with Kai for hours that night, about helping him understand that setting boundaries with toxic family members isn't betrayal, it's survival. I told him something that night that I want everyone here to understand, Kevin said, looking directly into the crowd. Sometimes the people who are supposed to love us the most are the ones who hurt us the deepest, and breaking free from that cycle isn't selfish, it's necessary. This message resonated throughout the room because it spoke to experiences that many people in the audience had lived through themselves. Kevin was using Kai's story to address broader truths about family, trauma, and healing. But Kevin wasn't done. He had one more revelation that would completely reframe how everyone viewed Kai's current success. Last month, Kevin said, Kai did something that shows you exactly what kind of person he really is. He bought his mother a house. Not a big mansion, not some flashy display of wealth, but a simple, safe home where she could finally have peace. The audience erupted in applause, but Kevin held up his hand to indicate he wasn't finished. But here's the part that broke me, Kevin continued. When I asked him about his father, about whether he'd help him get treatment, Kai said something that I'll never forget. He said, Kevin, I had to learn that you can't save someone who doesn't want to be saved, but you can save yourself, and sometimes that's the most loving thing you can do. The wisdom in those words, coming from someone so young who had been through so much, was staggering. Kevin's voice was completely broken now as he shared this final insight. That's when I realized, Kevin said through tears, that I wasn't talking to some kid streamer who got lucky. I was talking to a young man who had been forced to develop wisdom that most people never acquire in a lifetime. The emotional climax of Kevin's story came when he described Kai's current relationship with his father, who was now in rehab, finally ready to get clean. 3 weeks ago, Kevin revealed, Kai visited his father in treatment. First time they'd seen each other in over a year. And you know what his father said to him? He said, Son, I'm proud of you for being strong enough to save yourself when I couldn't. At this point, Kevin had to stop talking entirely. The comedian who makes millions of people laugh every year was standing on stage, tears streaming down his face, unable to speak. The audience was equally emotional. You could see people wiping their eyes, comforting each other, processing the weight of what they'd just heard. When Kevin finally composed himself enough to continue, his voice was different, softer, more reflective, but somehow stronger. That's why when I see Kai now, Kevin said, when I see him on his streams making people laugh, bringing joy to millions of people around the world, I don't just see a successful content creator, I see a survivor. I see someone who turned their pain into purpose, their trauma into triumph. Kevin's final message was directed at everyone in the room, everyone who would eventually hear this story. If you're going through something right now, Kevin said, looking directly into the crowd, if you're in a situation that feels impossible, if you're dealing with family trauma, addiction, abuse, whatever it is, I want you to remember Kai's story. I want you to remember that your current situation is not your final destination. The call to action was subtle but powerful. Kevin wasn't just telling a story, he was providing a roadmap for survival, for transformation, for hope. Subscribe to resilience, Kevin said with a slight smile, the first hint of his usual humor returning. Hit that notification bell on your own strength, and remember that every day you choose to keep going, you're already winning. The applause that followed was unlike anything anyone in that room had ever experienced. It wasn't just appreciation for a good story, it was recognition of shared humanity, of collective healing, of the power of vulnerability to transform pain into purpose. Kevin Hart had done something remarkable that night. He had taken his platform, his influence, his ability to command attention, and used it to shine light on a story that needed to be told. But more than that, he had shown everyone present the power of seeing people's full humanity, not just their public persona. As the applause finally died down and Kevin prepared to leave the stage, he had one final thought to share. The next time you watch Kai stream, Kevin said, the next time you see him being goofy, making jokes, bringing that energy that we all love, remember what it took for him to get there. Remember that sometimes the brightest lights come from the darkest places. The impact of Kevin's words that night extended far beyond the immediate audience. Videos of his emotional speech spread across social media, touching millions of people who saw their own struggles reflected in Kai's story. The streaming community, often criticized for being superficial or purely entertainment-focused, was reminded of the real human beings behind the cameras, the real stories behind the success. But perhaps most importantly, Kevin Hart had demonstrated something crucial about celebrity, about platform, about responsibility. He had shown that true influence isn't just about making people laugh or entertaining crowds. It's about using your voice to tell stories that matter, to shine light on experiences that need to be seen, to remind people that they're not alone in their struggles. The crowd that went silent that night didn't stay silent. They carried Kevin's words, Kai's story, and the message of resilience out into the world, spreading hope to people who needed to hear that survival is possible, that transformation is real, and that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to give up. That's the kind of moment that changes everything. That's the kind of story that reminds us why we connect with certain people, why we follow certain voices, why we believe in the power of human resilience to overcome even the darkest circumstances. And that's why Kevin Hart's emotional tribute to Cenat's journey will be remembered long after the applause faded and the crowd went home.